in the dusty stretch of the Arizona Territory, where the sky seemed to press down on the earth like a great blue hand, and every sound carried for miles across the quiet plains. A poor rancher named Caleb Hart lived in a weather-beaten shack that barely kept the wind out. Yet his heart held more strength than any fortified mansion in the East, because Caleb had survived years of hardship, drought, failed harvests, and the crushing loneliness that hovered over the frontier like a shadow. But nothing compared to the heavy truth he was about to face as he discovered that two young Apache twins, Nayeli and Nantan, children he had watched grow up from afar, children whose mother he had once quietly loved, before fate pulled their paths apart, were now targeted for a forced match to a brutal warband leader who wanted to claim them as symbols of power. Caleb knew the territory was changing, treaties were breaking. Settlers and tribes were both trapped in the grinding gears of greed and survival. And the warband wanted the twins not for marriage but for control, for the influence their family carried within the tribe. And the thought of those innocent girls being marched away in fear ignited something deep in Caleb, something fierce and ancient like the spark of lightning on a dry mesa. He remembered how Nayeli would bring him wildflowers when she was small, how Nantan would laugh at the way his old mule refused to move unless bribed with apples. And now the twins had grown into strong, proud young women with the same determined spirit their mother once had. And Caleb's heart pounded with a protective fire he had no right to feel yet, couldn't suppress. So when he overheard the talk in town, whispers of the warband chief sending men to retrieve the girls at dawn, Caleb acted without hesitation, riding through the cold night until his lungs burned and his eyes stung from the wind, reaching their family's small lodge, just as their uncle struggled to pack their belongings. Under orders he clearly despised, the twins stood by the fire, tense but silent, their eyes flicking toward Caleb in recognition and fear, and he saw immediately that they did not agree with this forced union, but felt trapped by tribal duty and the pressure placed on their uncle, who feared retaliation if he refused. Caleb stepped forward, breathless, dust clinging to his sweat-damp coat, and held up both hands in a gesture that was both desperate and respectful, telling them he meant no harm, only help. And when he declared that he would offer his own name, his life, his future, his identity, to shield them from the forced match, the lodge fell silent, because among the Apache, to offer one's name was to place oneself under the same protection, law, and responsibility as the family one stood for. And it was no small gesture for a white rancher who had nothing but an old horse, a few cattle, and a tiny ranch crumbling in the sun. Nayeli's eyes widened with shock, Nantan's breath caught, and their uncle stared as though Caleb had grown wings. But Caleb held firm, explaining that if he legally married one twin and pledged guardianship for the other until she chose her own path, the warband leader's claim would be invalidated under both territorial and tribal law, forcing the tribe's council to intervene. Yet Caleb felt his stomach twist, because he did not want to take advantage of these girls. He did not want them bound to him out of obligation, and so he promised, swore on everything he had lost and everything he still hoped for, that his offer was only a shield, not a chain, and they would be free to make their own choices once danger passed. Nayeli stepped forward first, her voice trembling, but steady as she asked why he would risk his life for them when he had nothing to gain. And Caleb felt the old ache rise within him as he admitted, quietly, that he had once loved their mother, a woman who showed him kindness when he was young and starving, and new to the territory, and that though she had built a family and future elsewhere, her memory had shaped him into a better man. So protecting her daughters was the least he could do. The twins exchanged a long, weighted glance, and Caleb could see the moment their fear transformed into a fragile thread of hope. But that hope was shattered when shouting erupted. Outside, the warband's scouts had already arrived, and suddenly, the lodge was filled with frantic movement as the uncle tried to stall for time and Caleb ushered the twins out the back, leading them toward his horse, urging them to run. But Nayeli refused to flee blindly, and Nantan grabbed a spear from beside the door, ready to defend themselves. And Caleb realized he was no longer protecting children but standing beside fierce young women who would rather fight for freedom than be taken alive. They ran into the night, the crunch of dry brush beneath their feet and the pounding hoofbeats of approaching riders thundering behind them. And Caleb felt the heat of adrenaline surge as he pulled the twins behind a rocky outcrop, whispering orders, planning their escape through the narrow canyon that led toward his ranch, hoping the terrain would slow the riders. But the scouts spotted them and arrows whistled past, striking sparks from stone, and Nyella stumbled but kept running, Nantan's spear held at the ready, Caleb's heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear the shouting behind them. The moon cast silver light over the desert, illuminating their desperate sprint, and Caleb cursed his poverty, his lack of weapons, his failing horse, everything except the determination burning in him like wildfire, because he refused to let history take another thing he cared for. He refused to let these girls be swallowed by the cruelty of men who saw them as bargaining pieces. When they finally reached his ranch, collapsing behind the barn for cover, Caleb knew they had only minutes before the riders closed in. And as he helped Naeli catch a breath and steadied Nantan's shaking hands, he felt something shift within him. Not love, not yet, but a fierce sense of belonging, a responsibility that felt written in the stars. And he told the twins that if they trusted him, if they allowed him to shield them with his name and stand against the warband, he would fight beside them until his last breath. The twins nodded, fear giving way to resolve, and together they prepared for the confrontation that would either save them or destroy everything Caleb had left. And as torches appeared on the ridge and the riders descended like wolves, Caleb whispered that if viewers were hearing this story, they should subscribe for the next chapter, because what happened next would change the fate of all three forever and ignite a storm the entire territory would never forget.